As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. For my final episode of season 1, I wanted to do something a little different. After months of asking other people questions, I decided to invite 2 of the talented writers I work with onto the show so they could ask me a few questions I had a feeling other writers might benefit from. First, you'll meet Sara Pam Neufeld, a yoga teacher and former journalist working on a memoir about her quest for balance when life turned upside down. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and more recently, Newsweek and Scary Mommy. She has a beautiful free monthly newsletter where she shares dozens of breathing and meditation practices recorded by her late mother. To learn more about Sara or to sign up for her newsletter, please see the show notes. Before we get to her interview, I have a couple of questions for you. What makes it difficult to tell your story? Is it something internal, or is your answer based on something you learned or a way you were trained? Keep this in mind as you listen to my conversation with Sara Pam Neufeld. Well, hello, Sara. I am so glad that you are here today on the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
Well, it is my honor and pleasure because we've been working together for a while. And when I was coming up with the idea for this podcast, I wanted to make sure that clients and students and other people could ask me questions. And so you've come today with some questions to ask. So, what is the first question? What would you like us to know?
We have been working together as I'm writing a memoir, and it's my first time doing deeply personal writing after nearly 20 years as a journalist. And I've really appreciated your guidance on how to transition from journalistic writing to memoir writing, and would love to talk about that more with you today.
So, tell me what specific question you have.
I would love to discuss how to learn writing in scene and learning to write from memory when you don't have every single detail written down, as I was trained to do in my years doing newspapers.
This is such a great question. And I have worked with other journalists who've really struggled with this because I think when you're trained in a certain way, you can put yourself in a box. And there's nothing wrong with that because in journalism, facts are everything. You know, that's where the truth comes from is your ability to not just render but verify the facts. So that's what you had to do. However, the truth in memoir and other forms of creative nonfiction comes from a different place. It's about exploring the heart and coming to a sense of the truth of the heart, like settling a question. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to get it wrong, especially in early drafts, and to create a world for yourself. Because when you're working in journalism, you're interviewing other people, you're, gathering information, you're recording information, and that's what you're disseminating to other people. The facts come from your flawed memories in creative nonfiction. So I think the first piece is to figure out what is needed to make it safe so that you can give yourself permission to trust something that is deeply flawed. And so as you think about your role as a journalist and this shift, other people I've worked with, they've talked about the shield that they build. Like there's this shield around you when you're a journalist. You do not insert yourself into the story for the most part. What has that shield been like for you, and what fears does it create around this process?
Well, it is interesting to turn the notebook on myself. And that literally is what I did. I am writing in my memoir about primarily a period of years when my family responsibilities were so overwhelming that I had to stop paid work. And it was like you took the journalist out of the newsroom, but it was still in me. And so I just started taking notes on my own life. My first draft, I was only writing what was exactly verbatim
Yeah.
in my notebook, but then there's not nearly enough details to create the full scene and picture that you need to tell a book. So that's been a transition. And then, of course, it's scary because it's me and my life and my family. And I always had nerves when I would publish a big article, especially when I was a reporter. I loved longer features where I would spend a long period of time following someone. And it was scary when it would come out. Like, what are they going to think? You're not supposed to show them a draft in advance. I was very big on fact checking with people in advance, but I never would show anyone a draft. And then, I would be like waiting with bated breath to see what, when they read it, what are they going to think? But then the
Yeah.
bottom line is, probably I'm not going to be in touch with that person anymore. Or maybe if it's my beat, I still have to see them, but it's on a professional basis.
Mhm.
This is my family and my life. And so that there's much more vulnerability. But it also, if I were to ever go back to writing about other people, I now very much understand what it feels like
Yeah.
to be the one that's getting put out there.
Yeah. And, you just brought up this important point in your past career, and you've written for big places, right? So name some of those places that you've written for just briefly.
Well, I was on staff at the Baltimore Sun and before that, the San Jose Mercury News.
Mm.
And then through the Hechinger Report, which partners with mainstream media, I got to write for the New York Times, National Public Radio, Slate, The Atlantic, NBC News. Feels like almost a different lifetime.
We're going to talk about what do you do with that different lifetime later on in this segment. But everything you've done has not only been for an audience, it's been for a big audience. And so when you're first writing memoir, the first thing you want to do is write specifically for yourself. That's the only audience that matters, especially at the stage you're at with your project, which is you're still trying to figure out what that story is. And so that's really important because what you want to do with the writing is settle a question that's rolling around in your soul. Like, what is it that is motivating me and propelling me to work on this project? And that's important because the story comes from the way your memories of what happened intersects with what you can verify that happens. And Laura Davis in episode 4, she talks about how getting it wrong was a big part of the story and trusting that
Mhm.
what shows up in memory is important. So, what I would say is when you're writing those scenes, learn what a scene is supposed to do. And there's so many craft books out there. Tristan Rainier has some great resources in her book, Your Life is Story, and Acetylene
I
Torch
love that
Songs.
one.
That's a really good one. Acetylene Torch Songs, which just came out by Sue William Silverman, also has some great resources and information on how to write a scene and the difference between scene, summary, and exposition. But allow the scene that's in your mind, that whatever that movie is in your mind, to make its way to the page. And don't worry about whether or not it's true, because you can go back and interrogate that memory to see what else belongs or what's true or what you want to fix later on. And the reason I say to do that is because when you write in scene, you give control of the story over to your unconscious for a little while. And things will come out that you wouldn't expect. And readers, especially your beta readers, are going to see things that are going to give you additional insights into the story. And that's so important because in beginning drafts, especially when we have fear, we all have fear. I mean, every writer that comes to the page has some fear. And one of the things we do when we are afraid is we try to control. And so when we cleave too closely to the facts, or we want to outline so much that we don't want to wander, that's a way of controlling the narrative. And to get to the truth of the heart, you have to let go of the narrative for a little while.
So interesting and so against my journalism school training.
Oh my gosh, it's a completely different paradigm. And I think when we are shifting gears like that, whenever change is, presented to us and we're inviting it into our lives, we want to say, what is going to help make this safe? And so as you think about allowing flawed memories to be the story on the page for now, which, you're going to fact check later, what do you think you need to make that process safe?
I think it's not so much feeling unsafe as it is just learning how to use new muscles for me.
Mhm.
I feel like I have my story, but I'm very trained to write with summary and exposition and not as much in scene. And again, to only write what I really know. And the memoir is also a much more internal
Yes.
journey. And so it's caused me to have to do a lot of reflection
Hmm.
and work on myself and with myself to be able to do that exploration.
Yeah, the inner work of memoir is so important, and it is no joke.
No, it's not.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that can happen that can be challenging for some writers is that summary and exposition. So, summary is just when you're summarizing something. If you're not familiar with these terms, exposition is when you're telling, where scene writing is showing. So, those are some other ways to think about this. When you are just telling, like, I felt sad, this thing happened, you're using a certain part of your brain, this logical brain in the prefrontal cortex. When you're writing in scene, you are activating other parts of your brain, these sensory parts of your brain, your occipital lobe, your auditory processing centers, all of these different things. And there is a way that you are reliving at the nervous system level at the same time that you're writing. And for some writers, that can be really intense, especially if you're writing those really deep scenes that crack your heart open. And so,
Yeah.
I always tell people, go slowly as you do this work. Trust that the goal isn't just to get it out there, but to make meaning from it. And that's where that inner work comes from, whether it's with a therapist or, with some other kind of healer or with your writing group or just even with yourself at times, is to say, what else is there? What is the brokenness in me that I am correcting or healing? And often it's not even brokenness, it's almost like the mud that's what's covering the brilliance. So how can I sweep the mud
Mhm.
away to get to that brilliance? And so when you do the inner work of writing your memoir, what have you done so far?
So I'm also a yoga teacher, and it's a lot of my story, but having to really live the practice alongside the writing,
Yes.
doing my meditation, my breathing. I've been doing a ton of work on nervous system regulation through a lot of means. And part of that is related to the memoir, and part of it is just my own healing journey. But I think that they go very much hand in hand. My book deals with the loss of my mother and then my grandmother, who I was caring
Mhm.
for 3 years after my mother died. And my very beginnings of this book were right after my grandmother died. I just started writing to process it. And then that's been 3 years that it's taken to become the shape of a story that I hope will be of value to others as well as to me.
And I love what you just said about the shape of a story because that makes me think of yoga poses. Because I practice
Hmm.
yoga as well. However, I do not practice as well as you do. So if you ever want to see how beautifully Sara practices, you should check out her Instagram videos, which are just absolutely well done. When we're first learning a yoga pose, we are not going to do it very well. At least I'll say for myself because I'm not super
For
flexible.
anyone, for anybody.
And so, yeah, it's that repetition of getting into the shape, maybe working with someone like you who can correct the shape, who sees things in the shape, and then working towards whatever that final version is based on what your body is capable of doing.
Yeah, it's very much the same, the writing the memoir, as it is learning a yoga pose. It's something that's going to take repetition over time and a detailed exploration. One of the things I've been posting about recently on Instagram is just breaking down downward dog, because I think people go into yoga classes and just assume that they know how to do it. And it's actually a pose where a lot of people can get injured. And there's so many nuances to it. And you can keep coming back to it again and again and keep learning more about it. It's the same thing, absolutely, with the book.
Yeah, and so just figuring out what is the version of the pose for this book at this point. And I think at this point, it's allowing whatever the memory story is to make it to the page,
Mhm.
knowing that you're going to shape it further. And one of the ways that we often shape our work isn't necessarily what we're doing on our project, but it is our author platform and the things we might write in addition to this. And you had a second question that is related to your prior career and where you are now. And would you like to share that with us?
So I was in journalism for almost 20 years. I was also teaching yoga for several years. And then I had my kids, and my mom got sick. And then my grandmother came to live with me. So I ended up with like a 7-year gap on my resume where I was just inundated with family responsibilities. And so in some ways, it feels like I'm starting a career from scratch. I've gone back to teaching a little bit. I'm sharing what I know about yoga as I'm writing this book and starting to do essays. And I've created a website. I've created a monthly newsletter that's sharing meditations taught by my mom, which is very dear to my heart and related to my book. But it is, I'm 45 years old, and I feel like I'm at the beginning of a career again.
As you just listed all of those things, I just want to say it doesn't sound like the beginning. And yet, I also want to validate the path towards publication can feel so daunting for so many people that it can feel like just a drop in the bucket and there is so much more to do. And how in the world do you do that? And what I would say is that I want you to go back to your prior career. Like you are engaging with your yoga practice and you have published some things.
Yes.
Look at the topics you were working on in the past and just notice what you learned from it, because it's possible that that work was is going to serve as a springboard for whatever it is that you're going to talk about now, but maybe it's not going to be the same thing because you're in a different season of your life. So look at
Yes.
how did you craft that career and what can you take from it and bring to this part of your career, because you're not starting from ground zero. For example, you had relationships with editors in the past. So you know how to create those relationships. Not everybody does. And so, what wisdom did you learn about creating relationships with editors? How can you use that now in creating new relationships with new editors? Also, making a list of the editors that you worked with in the past and just asking yourself whether or not they would be an appropriate fit for some of the work that you're doing. Some will, some won't. And if they're not, do they know people who might be a good fit? Because I think networking with the network you had in the past can be really helpful, and to recognize that everything you've done in the past is going to fuel what you do now. And when it comes to your author platform, I think one of the biggest things you can do is think broadly. Like what is an umbrella topic that you can talk about in many different ways, so that no matter what you do, you're feeding an author platform that is also going to create interest for your book, so that everything is fueling it, and you want to do it with authenticity and with passion, and also within the time limits that you have as a busy person and a mom,
Still
right?
raising two little kids. I'm down to mostly one generation that I'm caring for every day, but my kids still have a lot of needs and occupy a ton of time. And I wouldn't want it any other way. I made a choice to step off the fast track to be here with them, but it makes rebuilding feel sometimes like a daunting process.
Absolutely. Motherhood is a full-time job. And that should never be discounted, ever. It's a full time job. And so you are, in doing this, taking on a full time job and then a part time job. And so, how do you do this in a way that works? So, we are out of time for today, but I want to give you the last word. What is it you want to take away from this, or what else would you like us to know?
Just that you have really been a gift for me to work with, Lisa. I'm not just saying that because I'm on your podcast, but you really have the skills to guide me and the others who have been in our writing group into this deep exploration of ourselves, and have taught me these skills that are different from what I needed in my prior work. So I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank you for being on the podcast and also for trusting me with this journey. It has been such a gift to work with you over the period of time that we've spent together, which is over a year now. And I
Yeah,
am just overjoyed to see where all of this takes you.
thank you.
Hey, writers, have you started a memoir only to get lost in a sea of endless stories that seem to go nowhere? Are you wading through the messy middle of the revision process and searching for your narrative arc? Have you received vague feedback from agents or publishers, or been explicitly told your book contains a lot of interesting and well written stories that follow in and then format? The solution to all three problems is the same: find your memoir's beats. But for most writers, it isn't as simple as buying a copy of Blake Schneider's book, Save the Cat, and following his formula. In fact, many memoirists find certain beats confusing, and some wonder if this contrived Hollywood formula will work for their book. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to teach Create Your Memoir's Beat Sheet on Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. During this 90-minute webinar, you'll learn how to capitalize on the benefits of a beat sheet, scrap the parts that might not serve your story, discover how a beat sheet can be used even with a nonlinear memoir, and gain confidence as you shape your material into a compelling book. Best of all, this webinar is just $25. You heard me, $25. That includes the webinar, a PDF of my slides, and a comprehensive workbook that will help you apply these principles to your story, no matter the structure you've chosen. So, if you want to tame your material, find your narrative arc, and feel confident that the book you're querying is truly the story you wish to tell, go to janefriedman.com and click online classes. Or make it easy on yourself and click on the link in the show notes. Now you'll hear from Lisa Rizzo, the author of the award-winning poetry collection Always a Blue House and in the poem An Ocean. Her work appears in journals including Long Ridge Review, The MacGuffin, Rain Taxi, and Brevity Blog. She was a 2022 writer-in-residence at Cray Garden Collective. Her most recent publication, a prose poem published by Silver Birch Press, is part of her memoir-in-progress. To visit Lisa's website, please see the show notes. Before we get to her episode, I have a couple of questions for you. Is there a technique you'd like to try, or would you like to push the boundaries of storytelling by trying something new? If that's you, pay close attention to my interview with Lisa Rizzo. Why, hello, Lisa. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so happy to have you on today.
This is so exciting. I've never been on a podcast before, so I'm really happy to be with you, Lisa, for my first time.
Well, I am honored to be the flagship experience that you have, the first one. And I'm also honored because we've been working together for a long time. You've had so many great questions that you have shared with me. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because you guys have a lot of great questions that other people also have. And so I want to give you an opportunity to share one of those questions today so that we can explore it for everyone.
Oh, that's great. It's going to be wonderful to have that opportunity to pick your brain some more.
So, what would you like us to know about you and your question?
Well, I am a poet. Someone recently said that they loved that I said I'm a poet who doesn't write poetry anymore. And so I've been working on a memoir since I believe 2016, a memoir about my relationship with my father. And so I'm in the last stages of my manuscript. Amazing how long it takes to write a memoir. And what I'm trying to do now is deepen the emotional beats and deepen the character arc, which is proven to be difficult. And so you and I have talked about the idea of using cathectic objects to deepen the emotional content. And I'm still struggling with the idea of how to create an arc of a cathectic
Hmm.
object.
Yeah, this is a great question. And first, let's begin by defining it to make sure everybody knows what this means. So, the word cathectic object is a synonym for something that T.S. Eliot talked about, which is the objective correlative. So, cathectic object is
Mm,
used in psychoanalysis. Objective correlative is something that T.S. Eliot used when it came to writing. And so, regardless of what word you use, it is a set of objects or a single object, a situation, or a chain of events that draws upon or evokes emotions in the reader. So it's something that you're doing, you're using a specific device to evoke meaning. And we do this because these objects or situations become a metaphor for what we're talking about. Now, this definition that I just shared with you came from Sue William Silverman's new book, Acetylene Torch Songs. I have a copy here. And so
mm,
I invite you to read what she has to say in her book. We're going to talk about it today, and I'm going to name a bunch of books. So, Lisa, for you and for anyone who's listening, do not panic. All of this will show up in the show notes. And for you, Lisa, because we are recording this well in advance of when this is going to air, I will send this to you by email. So, I want to give you some examples of books that you can read that do this really well. So, in Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking, she says life changes fast. Life changes in the ordinary instant. This is something that repeats multiple times throughout her book. Laura Cathcart Robbins, in her book Stash My Life in Hiding, she has these pills. Then the pills change meaning over time. Cheryl Strayed's backpack in her memoir Wild, the
mm,
actual glass castle that the dad talks about in Jeanette Wall's memoir, The Glass Castle, food in Kaisi Lemon's Heavy, and also in Abigail Thomas's Safekeeping. That's another thing. And Laura Davis, her twin, serves as a cathectic object or
mm,
adjective correlative in The Burning Light of Two Stars. And then two more examples are the hands in Sarah Perry's memoir After the Eclipse and singing for Ingrid Clayton in her memoir Believing Me. The reason I'm sharing this long list of examples is because one of the best ways to understand how this works is to read books that are doing it well so that you can see the example and say, okay, what is it that this author has done and how did they do that? And
mm,
commercial memoirs will sometimes have these, but you'll often see that literary memoirists are trying to capitalize on this. And so, a number of these are literary memoirs. So, there's what happens, and I want to give you an example of how these metaphors work because it's not just about repeating something that shows up again and again. With each repetition, the meaning has to change. So I want to give you an example from Jeanette Wall's book, The Glass Castle. So in that, early in the book, the father is giving her a star. That's one of her Christmas presents one year. Actually, it's her only Christmas present one year. And as he's helping her pick out her star, he talks about this glass castle that he's going to one day build. And then when he does this, life is going to be amazing. First time it shows up, it is a metaphor for hope and for, this bright future that is in front of this family. Later on, the glass castle shows up again and they're digging this foundation. And then dad talks about it again when his alcoholism is deepening. And at that point, there is a sense of longing and grief that happens. And in the end, it's really this moment of just tragedy and grief because we know that this father is never going to do this. It's really the symbolism of the disappointment that happens between this father and this daughter. So I offer that to show you that there are ways that it shows up again, but in each rendering, it has a different meaning. So when you're going back and you're looking at the books that speak to you, I want you to not just pay attention to these items where they are and how they're being portrayed or how much space they take up on the page. I want you to ask yourself this question: how does the meaning change each time
mhm,
it shows up? So, one of the things that writers struggle with, and I'm curious to know, I'm going to ask you in a moment if this is part of your struggle, is that once we hear about this idea, it seems fabulous and exciting, and oh, we want to do that. But then we begin to try to control the narrative and plan it
Mm.
out and figure out what it is. And you're not doing this. And I know this because you and I have worked together for a while and I know what your process is. But sometimes when writers are coming to their first few drafts, they want to start with a theme or they want to start with making a list of all of these objects. And you could certainly do this because there are 1,000 different ways to write, and each person has their own way of writing. But what I would say is that if you're planning too much at the beginning, you're not giving yourself permission to wander. And the best cathectic objects are things that organically show up again and again. So, what I would say is look at your manuscript and make a list of the things that show up. And then once you have that list, see which ones really connect to your heart and connect in an emotional way. Like, which ones do you have an emotional attachment to? The ones you have an emotional attachment to are probably the most likely examples of objective correlative or cathectic object in your manuscript. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, you and I have talked about this, and I'm still trying to, grapple with it. As a poet, I'm very aware of using symbol or metaphor, but a poem is
Mm-hmm.
contained. I actually
Yeah.
talk about that in my memoir. And so what I'm having trouble with is the idea of, like I said, the arc, but it's been really interesting to go back into my memoir and my manuscript and go, oh, I say that. I talk about, for instance, in my book, I talk about trees all the
Mm-hmm.
time. and and actually when I moved to Portland just 2 years ago, I started doing a study of trees in my neighborhood. So obviously trees mean something to me.
And I just want to say
So
that the trees in Portland are pretty fantastic.
yes, they are. It's one of the best things about Portland. And because my father was living in Portland when he started to get ill, which is the impetus for my memoir, the trees when I would visit him were important. So I've noticed trees happen all through my book.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of hands, windows, I've noticed about windows as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I've noticed these things now and I can pick through them. What I need to think about is how to, because you can't say, well, this tree means this and this tree means that. So, how do I depict these trees in a way to show emotional meaning at certain times in the book? And that's where I've been really pondering, how do I do that? Is it how I talk, describe them? Or I think it must be what's happening to the narrator at the time
Mm-hmm.
where the tree appears. And so I have to go back. I have to read a lot of those books you just you just mentioned to see how they're doing it. So I think that's basically my challenge right now.
Yeah, and that is one of the things that can be so difficult is like I can see that they're there. How the hell do I put them together in a way that does this kind of work? And I have two answers for that. Number
Hmm.
one, sometimes it's best to try it in the short form rather than trying to do this in a book where you have
Mm,
all of these different jobs and things that each, chapter and section must do. Maybe try to do this work in an essay.
mm,
Focus on doing it in an essay or even, doing some sort of a hermit crab essay, which is an essay where you choose a container, like maybe a grocery list or a syllabus, or I mean, there's a shampoo bottle, one that's brilliant, and it could be like an arborist guide. Like, what is the
mm.
arborist guide to my life? And you allow yourself to play off the page, away from your book, to begin to say, okay, well, what do trees mean to me? What is this? So that
Mm,
you can then take what you learn and put it back into your manuscript. Another way to think about this after you've done some play, and I certainly say play first. Play, 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 play. See what things mean. Then ask yourself, is there a question that the objects are answering, or the phrase? So I think about Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking. Life changes fast. Life changes in an ordinary instance. She says this multiple times in this book, and the question that each one of these is asking, within that scene is, well, what does it mean for life to change fast in an ordinary instant?
Mm-hmm.
First time, her husband is dead. Another time, her daughter is very sick. Then at the end, it's been a little while since I read the book. I believe, she learns what happened to her husband. And so there's these different moments where that phrase and the situation that it is paired with is answering the question of, what does it mean for life to change fast in the ordinary instance? If we look at Cheryl Strayed's book, Wild, what does it mean to carry a heavy load? What is the burden that you're
Right.
carrying, and what do you do with it? And this question is coming to me from having read her prologue. She mentions that, like, what do you do when you're in the woods and, you don't have what you need and just have this heavy backpack? You keep on walking. Well, what happens as you do that? So I think that's another thing that you can do is begin to say, what is the question that is related
Mm-hmm.
to these things? And so that will help you begin to think about, what is the arc or the evolution of
Mm-hmm.
this object over the course of time in your book. And then you can look at, how do you refine what you've already written so that you are amplifying that in a way that is elegant and isn't like, I'm using objective correlative today, can you find it, my friends? Right? We don't want to do that. But that you're doing that kind of work.
That's really interesting. It's so funny whenever we talk, I think of a poem that I've written before because I've written a poem about trees in my life. And so I need to go back and look at some of these things. And I like that idea of, I might even take all the trees that are in this book and take them, list
Mm-hmm.
them and then write about them. That's a really good idea. That's something that it's always nerve-wracking. You're like, if I'm revising, I'm in the manuscript and
Mm-hmm.
I'm chewing on what's bothering me. But the idea of taking it away from the book and just looking at these images on their own
Yes.
is that's a very interesting idea, which I hadn't thought about. So that's going to be my next step, I think, in revision. Okay, that's a really good idea because I think that it's that, when you have this huge piece, how do you keep track? It's even,
Mm-hmm.
like you got to find all those places, and so I think yeah, okay, that's good. I like that idea.
Yeah, definitely play off the page. And because you're a poet, I wonder if there is a poetic form, like a form that you could use that would could be like the evolution of trees. Or, you
Mm-hmm.
set a title, right? That's going to establish a promise for your poem. And then in each one, it's like a discrete poem about the tree, a
Mm-hmm.
specific tree, and then you see what happens when they come together. And that might be something to do because you're a poet, a way to play.
Mm-hmm.
Another way that you could play is with collage. Or so you don't even have to work in words. What if you found like an image online, or you even created your own photograph of those
Mm.
trees, just to see like what happens when you look at it and you have an image that you're actually looking at, rather than the memory of an image that you're trying to render.
Oh, that's interesting too, especially since photographs are a big part of my life and appear
Exactly.
obviously pathetic objects in my book because my father was a photographer. So that's an interesting idea. Oh, you're going to take me back to poetry, Lisa.
The poet who doesn't write poems is now going to write some poems.
I did write some poems. Yeah. I started trying to work on this just yesterday, and it feels daunting to
Yeah.
go through, one by one. And I need to do some mapping, I think. And like you say, first play with it to understand the meaning, and then try to see how this can play out throughout the book. Really good. I like that idea a lot.
Well, I can't wait to see how this blossoms for you.
Yeah, you've given me a lot of really good ideas. And I keep thinking you can see I'm like, let's see, how could I do this? So you've given me a new way to approach revision, which I think that's one of the things that when you get to the end part of your book, of writing your first, your manuscript, it becomes like, what do you do now?
Yeah.
I know it's not done. I know it's not done. I can feel it's not there yet, but how do I take it to that next level? And that's what I'm struggling with now. And so these are some good ideas.
Well, wonderful. Well, I'm really excited to see where this takes you. We are out of time. I want to give you, is there any last thing that you would like to say as we wrap up?
Just I'm excited to start doing this again, getting into this and approaching this in a new way. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Well, you are very welcome, and I hope that you go write directly after this interview.
I'm going to. I really will. All right. Thank you.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.